In 1958, in the depths of Kentucky's Appalachian Mountains, there was such a dark secret that it remained buried for decades. The Blackwood family, established in that isolated region since the 19th century, had a practice that challenged not only the laws of society but also those of nature itself. This is the disturbing account of generations of consanguineous unions that resulted in one of the most impactful stories of human genetics ever documented on American soil. The Blackwood lived on a 40-acre remote property, surrounded by dense vegetation and protected by steep escarpment that made access almost impossible for strangers. The family had developed a self-sufficient system, cultivating their own food and rarely coming down to the neighboring city of Pine Creek, a community of only 800 inhabitants at the time. Sarah Jenkins, now 89 and one of the last living witnesses of events, describes what many in the region suspected. They came to the city maybe twice a year to buy what they couldn't produce. Always the same man, Augustus Blackwood, with suspicious eyes and pale skin. He never had the family. The history of the Blackwood officially begins in the records with Jeremiah Blackwood, which arrived in that region in 1871, fleeing legal problems in Virginia. The documents of the time show that he was accompanied only from his sister cousin, who would later become his wife, and together they established what would become a dynasty, isolated by their own choice. At that time, the marriage between cousins was not uncommon, especially in remote regions, explains Dr. Martin Calloway, a geneticist at Kentucky University who extended the Blackwood case. The problem arises when this pattern repeats for generations, exponentially increasing the risk of recessive genetic conditions manifest. And that's exactly what happened to the Blackwood. For almost 90 years, the family maintained a closed lineage, with weddings occurring exclusively among close relatives. Brothers with sisters, parents with daughters, uncles with nieces, a web of relationships that created a progressively committed genetic code. In 1958, when the story came to light, the family was in the 5th generation of consanguineous unions. The patriarch was Augustus Blackwood, great-grandson of Jeremiah, who kept under control a property that housed 27 people, all related to Complex and Nearby Way. The revelation of what was happening on the Blackwood property occurred when a severe storm hit the region in March 1958. A flood destroyed part of the isolated road that led to the property, forcing Augustus to seek medical help from the family members who had been injured during the storm. Dr. William Carter, then Pine Creek's only doctor, was called to accompany Augustus back to the property. What he found there would forever change his perception of human capacity for isolation and the biological consequences of consanguineous unions. "I will never forget that day," Carter wrote in his diary, recovered only in 1982 after his death. The main house was large but decaying. There were other small buildings scattered throughout the property. Augustus took me to a converted barn, where I found a young man of about 25 years with a broken leg. But that is not what crashed me. It was his appearance, protruding, significantly retreated jaw, cast fingers, and evident cognitive difficulty. While treating the injury, Dr. Carter noticed sounds coming from the barn upstairs. Augustus tried to dissuade him to investigate, but the doctor insisted, claiming to check if there were other injuries. What he found on the 2nd floor was described by him as a vision that will haunt me until my last days. 5 individuals, aged the doctor between 15 and 40 years old, were confined in makeshift rooms. All had severe physical deformities, many unable to speak understandably, some with extremely limited mobility. Hygiene conditions were precarious, although there was evidence that someone was trying to keep them fed and minimally cared for. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. The science behind these cases can reveal genetic secrets that impact the health of all mankind, including yours, and it is essential to understand how genetics shaped our evolution. When confronted, Augustus Blackwood initially reacted with hostility, but realizing the severity of the situation, eventually revealed a disturbing story that had developed for generations. According to him, the family believed it was purifying blood through these unions, a distorted belief that had been passed as a family tradition. My grandfather. He said that our blood was special, that it should not be mixed with that of strangers, Augustus would have explained to Dr. Carter. When the first babies were born different, we believe it was just a temporary trial, that the next generations would be stronger. County records, though scarce, confirm part of this story. Between 1871 and 1958, only 7 birth certificates were officially registered for the Blackwood family, an inconsistent number with the known size of the family. Subsequent investigations revealed that many births occurred on the property without any official record, allowing the family to maintain its most affected members completely out of public knowledge. Unregistered births allowed Blackwood to maintain those with the most severe hidden deformities of society. These individuals have never attended schools, never received proper medical attention, and in many cases never left the limits of property throughout their lives. The Blackwood case represents one of the most extreme examples of documented voluntary genetic isolation in modern America, explains Dr. Eleanor Whitney, an anthropologist who studied the case in the 1970s. What makes this case particularly unique is that, unlike other isolated communities that occasionally practiced consanguineous marriages by necessity or traded, Blackwood OOs, they did systematically and intentionally for almost a century. After the initial discovery, Dr. Carter faced a significant ethical and legal dilemma. Kentucky laws at the time already prohibited marriages among close relatives, but intervention in isolated communities was complicated, especially considering that many of the adults on Blackwood property had never been officially recorded as citizens. After 3 days of deliberation, Carter decided to report the case to local authorities. Sheriff James Monroe, accompanied by 2 deputies, visited the property on April 2, 1958. The official report describes an extremely suspicious family, with members who had clearly never interacted with strangers. "We find a worrying situation that requires immediate intervention," Monroe wrote in his report. "Individuals with obvious medical needs, inappropriate living conditions for those with disabilities, and clear signs of forced isolation from some family members." The intervention of the authorities led to the removal of 8 Blackwood property individuals, all with significant physical deformities and varying degrees of cognitive impairment. They were initially taken to the Lexington Regional Hospital, where doctors extended their conditions. Dr. Howard Phillips, a geneticist who examined members of the Blackwood family in 1958, documented a series of conditions that are now recognized as typical of highly endogamic populations: polydactyly, extra fingers; syndactylia, fusion of fingers; microcephaly, severe facial anomalies, and multiple mental cases. "What we are seeing here," Phillips wrote in his medical report, "is the manifestation of rare recessive genes that in populations with greater genetic diversity would remain numb. When close relatives have children, the likelihood that both carry the same harmful recessive gene increases dramatically, resulting in the conditions we observed." Younger members of the family have revealed equally disturbing aspects of life on Blackwood property. Martha, then 19 years old and one of the few who could communicate clearly, described how the most evident members were kept separated from the others, living in structures adjacent to the main house. "Mom said it was to protect them," Martha explained to social workers, "that the world out there would be cruel to them, but I think it was more to hide them. Some of them I only saw when I carried food." The authorities faced an unprecedented situation when dealing with the Blackwood family. Most adults removed from the property had no official documentation, no birth certificates or school records or doctors. Legally, they did not exist. The case generated a significant ethical debate. On the one hand, the living conditions of those kept isolated were clearly inadequate. On the other hand, the family had developed its own care system, however rudimentary, and external intervention represented a traumatic rupture for individuals who had never known another reality. "The discovery of the Blackwood exposed a flaw in our social system," says Dr. Richard Branson, a medical ethics expert who analyzed the case decades later. "As a society, we assume that certain practices are universally avoided, but the case has shown that in sufficient isolation, communities may develop radically different norms with devastating consequences." During the weeks that followed the initial intervention, The authorities mapped the complex family structure of the Blackwood. Augustus, then 47, was simultaneously cousin and half-brother of his wife, Eliza. Of the 9 children who had together, 3 had severe deformities and had been kept in the adapted barn. The investigation revealed that this practice of separation had begun 2 generations before, when the first obvious signs of genetic problems began to appear. Initially, these individuals were kept as part of the family, but as deformities became more pronounced in subsequent generations, the family adopted the practice of isolating them. Robert Blackwood, Augustus' cousin and one of the few members of the family that occasionally left the property to work seasonally on neighboring farms, provided a disturbing witness. It started with my grandfather saying that the family's blood was special, that we should keep our lineage pure. When the babies began to be born, different. He said it was a test of our faith, which would eventually be born children. If perfect kids would be born. We continued. This distorted belief had become a kind of family religion, with the patriarch of each generation reinforcing the need to maintain the purity of the lineage, despite the growing evidence of damage caused. District Prosecutor Richard Thornton initially considered presenting criminal accusations against family adults, but the situation had significant legal complexities. Many of the practices had begun in previous generations, when the laws were less clear, and there was no evidence of intentional cruelty, only of extreme ignorance and isolation. Media attention was another complicating factor. When the first reports began to circulate, journalists from all over the country converged to Pine Creek. The history of the Blackwood, with their disturbing elements of isolation, consanguineous unions and hidden family members, captured the imagination of the American audience. If you've heard about our history, stop a moment and think about the human suffering behind the sensational headlines. These are real people, whose lives were shaped by terrible decisions they have not chosen. Leave a comment with the phrase genetics to show that you understand the seriousness of this case. Louisville Courier-Journal was the first to publish a detailed article on the case on April 15, 1958, with the title, "Isolated Family Reveals Dark Genetic Secrets in the Kentucky Mountains." The article, although sensationalist in some respects, brought the first public analysis of the scientific implications of the case. Dr. James Richardson, a geneticist at the University of Louisville, explained to the report, "What we see in the Blackwood case is a dramatic demonstration of the dangers of repeated consanguineous unions. Each generation increases the concentration of shared genes and consequently the likelihood that harmful recessive conditions manifest." The article included property photographs, but not family members, by court decision. Even so, the impact was immediate. Letters began to reach the newspaper, some expressing compassion, some horror, and some, disturbingly, showing morbid fascination by the case. Mary Sullivan, a social worker designated to work with the younger members of the family, documented the difficult transition they faced. They are simultaneously traumatized by the separation of their family and dazzled by a world they could barely exist. Elizabeth, 12, had never seen a television before and believed that people inside were real, just very small. The 8 individuals removed from the property were eventually divided between medical institutions and temporary adoptive homes. For those with more severe deformities and significant cognitive impairment, the future was uncertain at a time when care options for people with disabilities were limited. The Blackwood case has caused significant changes in social assistance and surveillance policies in Kentucky isolated communities. In the following weeks, the state's Social Services Department implemented a specific program to identify and monitor families living in extreme isolation in the mountainous regions. "We cannot allow another situation like Blackwood to develop without intervention," said Kentucky Governor A.B. Chandler at a press conference in May 1958. "We respect people's rights to live according to their traditions, but not when these practices result in clear damage to vulnerable individuals." Blackwood property has been partially expropriated by the state to cover care costs, EDICOS, and assistance to family members who were now under government protection. Augustus and some adults from the family were allowed to remain in a reduced portion of the original land under regular supervision of the authorities. The fate of individuals removed from the property varied considerably. The 4 with the most severe disabilities were sent to the Pine Meadows State Institute, an institution for people with intellectual and physical disabilities. Although well-meaning, the institution at the time offered mainly basic care, with few opportunities for development or integration. They went from one type of isolation to another, said Dr. Whitney in her study of the case. The difference is that they now received proper medical care and decent living conditions, but they were still separated from the mainstream society. For the younger ones, and those with less severe disabilities, attempts were made of integration. Martha and Elizabeth Blackwood, for example, were placed in a foster home in Lexington and eventually managed to attend a special school. Martha, who demonstrated remarkable intelligence despite limited education, eventually became an important voice in awareness of the dangers of consanguinity. In a rare interview granted in 1978 at the age of 39, Martha reflected on her experience. "I grew up believing that our way of life was normal, that the outside world was that it was strange and dangerous. The transition was painful, but necessary. Today I understand that what happened in our family was the result of ignorance and isolation, not evil." The scientific aspect of the Blackwood case has become the object of study at universities across the country. In 1962, Dr. Phillips published a detailed article in the Journal of Medical Genetics, analyzing the inheritance patterns and phenotypic manifestations observed in the family. The Blackwood case gives us an unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of extreme endogamy on humans, Phillips wrote. Observed anomalies confirm theories about recessive gene expression in isolated populations and help us better understand genetic inheritance mechanisms. The article thoroughly documenting the various conditions observed. In addition to those already mentioned tamctilia and syndactyly, cases of leporine lip, palatal cleft, microcephaly, prognathism, protruding maxillary, and a series of skeletal abnormalities. In some individuals, multiple conditions coexisted, creating complex clinical paintings. Blood analyses performed, using the techniques available at the time, confirmed the high degree of consanguinity, with serum protein patterns showing significantly larger homozygotes than the general population, a clear marker of endogamy. A particularly disturbing aspect of the case was the evidence that deformities had become progressively more severe over the generations. Recovered photographs of the property, showing members of different generations of the family, revealed a clear pattern of worsening physical anomalies. "What we are watching," Dr. Calloway explained in a 1965 genetics symposium, "is the cumulative effect of endogamic depression, the reduction of biological aptitude due to increased homozygousness. Each generation of consanguineous marriages increased the likelihood that harmful alleles manifest in homozygosis." The case also caused significant ethical discussions in the medical community. While some researchers saw Blackwood primarily as an object of scientific study, others emphasized the human dimension of tragedy and questioned whether intervention could have occurred before. "There were signs," said Dr. Carter in his statement. "People in the city suspected that something was wrong with that family for decades, but respected their isolation by tradition. This raises questions about when respect for privacy should give way to concern for well-being." 67 years after the initial discovery, Blackwood's legacy continues to reverberate both science and society. The original property was completely abandoned in the 1970s after Augustus's death, and today is just a collection of vegetation-invaded ruins, a silent memorial for a human tragedy that developed far from the eyes of society. Martha Blackwood has devoted much of her adult life to educate people about the dangers of consanguinity. Prior to her death in 2009, she helped establish a foundation that offers genetic counseling for isolated communities in the Appalachians, where genetic knowledge can still be limited. "What happened to my family was not just a personal tragedy," she wrote in her memoirs, published in 1990. "It was a collective failure of education, social assistance, that allowed people to live so margin that they could develop such harmful practices without intervention." Advances in genetics in the following decades provided an even deeper understanding of what happened to the Blackwood. DNA analyses performed in 1992 with some of the survivors confirmed what scientists of the time only suspected. The family's endogamy coefficient was among the highest ever documented in human studies of European royalty. What the Blackwood case has taught us, explains Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, a geneticist of Johns Hopkins University, is that genetic diversity is not just an abstract concept, but a fundamental biological need. When a population, even if it is only a family, is genetically isolated by generations, the consequences are inevitable and often devastating. Blackwood's history has also changed the way the social assistance system addresses isolated communities. The Kentucky program in response to the case was later adapted by other states with remote rural populations, with emphasis on offering unnecessary judgment or interference in traditional lifestyles. The challenge, explains Robert Thompson, current director of Kentucky's Department of Social Services, is finding the balance between respecting communities' autonomy and ensuring that harmful practices do not occur in isolation. The Blackwood case has taught us that compassionate intervention may be necessary even when not requested. Blackwood case lessons echo beyond the Apalhis. Worldwide, researchers cite the case by studying other isolated populations, from closed religious communities to minority ethnic groups who, for cultural or geographical reasons, practice endogamic marriages. Which makes the Blackwood case so valuable from the scientific point of view, explains Dr. Calloway, is that he did not only do the end result, but the gradual process by which genetic isolation led to the progressive manifestation of hereditary conditions over several generations. Today, the few direct descendants of the Blackwood who know their family history usually prefer to remain anonymous, fearing the stigma associated with the case. Many have changed their surnames and completely integrated into the mainstream society. One of these descendants who requested anonymity shared, "I grew up without this story. When I discovered at 19 it was a shock. I immediately sought genetic counseling and found that as my grandfather had married outside the family, my risk of carrying harmful genetic conditions is not significantly greater than that of the general population." The Blackwood case remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and ignorance about basic principles of genetics. It also highlights how distorted beliefs can be perpetuated in closed communities, leading to practices that, seen from the outside, seem clearly harmful, but which from within can be perceived as traditions to be preserved. The story does not end with the Blackwood, concludes Dr. Reynolds. Even today in various parts of the world, there are communities where marriage between close relatives is common, either by cultural tradition, geographical isolation, or lack of knowledge about associated risks. What we learn from Blackwood remains relevant and necessary. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to leave your like and share this story with others that you believe would be interested in these historical and scientific accounts that reveal little-known aspects of human genetics. And remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to lose our next investigations into cases that science is still trying to fully understand.